he gets off color, he gets politically incorrect, which is why we like him in many ways.
The movie would have gotten a lot more popular with all of the wrong people for all of the wrong reasons.
He catches a bunch of guys quite literally with their pants down.
Relinquishing yourself to violent tendencies as well.
Andrew Kevin Walker is not a serial killer because he wrote something.
It never gets better.
He has not had a stable romantic life.
Why do you want plaid instead of striped?
People are going to yell at me for saying that. So New York was in dire straits in many ways in the mid-'70s when this film was made. And one of my favorite stories I came across when I was reading up for this was a couple months after production. I guess there was a need for some sort of federal aid for New York City, and President Ford denied it. And the New York Daily News ran the headline, "Ford to City, drop dead."
That's great. Was that had to be, did you say what paper that was?
The New York Daily News.
Okay, all right. I figured it was either that or the Post, because
Yeah.
the Post is great with headlines like that, but Daily News also makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
We learned a lot about headlines like that in when I went to school for film. I also got a second major in journalism, and for that journalism major, one of the classes I had the same professor twice, and the reason I had her, despite the fact that when I walked in senior year after having her for a class sophomore year, and she said, "Second time, really?" Because most students hated her because she was very difficult, she was very challenging, and she had zero patience for not fulfilling assignments to the degree she expected of you. Not necessarily to the degree she expected of the class, but of you. And I loved it because I was like, oh, you feel like a real editor-in-chief at a newspaper. And like, this is great. This is exactly what I want in a journalism class. I want to be pushed every single day, even on the days I don't want to be pushed. And she's great at it. And it was funny because she was so hard on people, and particularly on me in the class. But whenever I went to her, office hours?
Yeah.
Amazingly sweet person. So good.
Yeah, I had a couple professors like that where I went to I didn't go to the most competitive school, and I took full advantage of that when I could. But I did have 2 or 3 professors that were the opposite, and it was pretty rewarding to do those classes and be like, oh, like this is what like real college should be like if I was not like coasting through most of this. And I had the similar experiences of like feeling like the course was kicking my ass, and then speaking to the professor offline, offline essentially, and feeling like, oh, this person genuinely is like, they gave me a B- or whatever, but like they want me to succeed here, and they're willing to help me do that.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite things about that and about her was every day we had class, which wasn't every day of the week, but every day during the week that we had class, we had to, on the way to class, pick up a hard copy of the New York Times and the New York Post. And we would, at the beginning of class, go through them both and analyze them.
That sounds like an incredible assignment.
Oh, it was great. It was great. It was every class. And the things that we learned were that journalistic standards are higher than that of even the New York Times, which, granted, the school I went to, that was considered the gold standard for journalism, at least in America, which it still is in many instances.
So who's setting the standards higher than the New York Times? Is that like a professional association?
Associated Press.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Associated Press has what's called the AP Style Book.
Yep.
And that style book essentially has rules for journalistic writing. And so there are rules and guidelines within that book, and it's a thick book. It's like that big. And they exist to facilitate fast, clear, and concise writing for an audience to get across as much information as possible. For example, one of the rules of journalism is that an individual should be able to have an entire understanding of the story within the first 2 paragraphs.
Interesting.
The headline in the first 2 paragraphs should tell an individual everything they need to know about that story. After that, that's extra bonus material that they can consume if they want to, that gives them deeper context. But the entire point being that the opening paragraph and then the nut graph which is the second paragraph, creates an understanding of the current situation and enough about the context around it to be able to need nothing else. And there are plenty of stories in the New York Times that don't do that. And the reason why that was valuable is because prior to digital journalism, print journalism did not need to hold your attention for ad revenue because you've already paid for the paper.
Right.
The whole point was you should be able to get through this paper 2 paragraphs at a time after you've bought it, before you get to your office.
Makes sense.
The whole idea being is that, you can get informed for the day very quickly, but if you want more context, you want to go back and read more at a later time, something like that, then you can. And that principle still exists in print. That's why we had to get the print versions, because the print versions of the stories are different than that on the websites.
Really?
The websites have writing designed to keep you reading and trickle you information until the end of the article because they need that ad revenue.
Yep.
But because the print version is already paid for, that still has the normal journalistic styling of the opening paragraph and the nut graph, giving you the bulk of the information you need, and then obviously the extra context if you want. But the reason why I bring this up to begin with is because the reason we got the New York Post wasn't only as a foil to how the New York Times covers the story, but specifically because, according to my professor, the New York Post, being a slightly more tabloidy style newspaper, has some of the best headlines written ever. And it's the headlines like that. Whereas, if the same story is being covered in the New York Times versus the Post, the New York Times is going to be a little bit more, academic, a little bit more pretentious at times. New York Post is just going to tell you exactly what it is in the most, excessive way possible.
Right.
That's never particularly inaccurate, at least if it's done right.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the kind of sharp edge titling that's going to get you to pick up the paper.
Yeah, Ford to City Drop Dead is going to make me buy a paper.
Exactly.
Every time.
And that's the type of headline you would expect in the Post, not so much in the Times. And granted, things have changed over the course of history, but, generally those principles hold similar.
So I I want to kind of front load this real quick. I'm not referring to these directly in the episode. I just brought them as props. These are a couple books that I used for research. This one I got at Tarantino's Theater, the New Beverly, which basically just goes through the films that shaped him.
Where is that? Is that in LA?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And
I saw a few things there. I saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood there. I saw The Thin Red Line there. I saw Scarface there. But it's cool, just sort of personal memoir going through the films that influenced him heavily. He's got a chapter on Taxi Driver, which I referred to for this. It's a really cool book. It's very Tarantino. It's he gets off color. He gets politically incorrect, which is why we like him in many ways. But yeah, that was a cool source. And then this one I just got recently is Martin Scorsese, All the Films. I've shown you this before. It's supposed to be like a coffee table book. I've just been kind of reading it cover to cover.
Mm-hmm.
But it goes through literally everything Scorsese has done, from features, obviously, to documentaries, which he's had a prolific career in, music videos, short films.
I wonder if they're going to do an updated version of this at any point, given, I think, when does this end?
It goes all the way to Killers, I believe.
It does go all the way to Killers. He's doing another one, though, isn't he?
He's got a film with Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, which is cool. It's called What Happens at Night. It's a psychological horror and ghost story adapted from a 2020 novel by Peter Cameron. A married couple travel to a remote, snowbound European town to adopt a baby. After checking into a massive, nearly deserted hotel, they face baffling obstacles and uncanny events that threaten their marriage and reality itself. That's according to Deadline. Also featuring Mads Mikkelsen, Patricia Clarkson, and Jared Harris, which I think is very cool. I like when Scorsese steps out a little bit. I've found that although I love his classics, you might say, like Goodfellas and such, I like his departures from the norm. Like, one of my favorite Scorsese movies is The Age of Innocence, which has nothing in common with any other Scorsese movie, because it is about a lawyer in a love triangle in high society in New York City.
I did not know that he did a doc on the Stones.
He's done so many docs. He's done one on Bob Dylan. He's done one on Michael Jackson. He did concert films were kind of a thing he did for a while. He has one that I'm disappointed to find is inaccessible anywhere, which is about the New York Review of Books for their 50th anniversary. He did a documentary on them, and it has been scrubbed from existence, unfortunately.
That's unfortunate. That is really unfortunate. I gotta say, one of the things that I find really interesting is that they don't get talked about a lot, but there are a lot of creatives in the industry that do interesting docs on especially musicians.
Mm-hmm.
Like another prime example that I'm thinking of is actually, I believe, the cinematographer, yes, for the film that I just opened the page to, which is Kundun.
Obviously, Scorsese's best film.
Yeah, right. But Deakins was the cinematographer on it.
Yeah.
And he did a lot of concert stuff back in his early days. He did a lot of what they in Britain called pop promos, which are music videos. And I find that interesting. I also, it's so interesting because I would never have guessed about the concert and music stuff in here. It's interesting we don't talk about that more in relation to Scorsese.
Yeah, that'd be a fun episode for us to do at some point, going through his non-narrative work.
It would. Anyway, please continue.
Oh, yeah. So I thought it'd be cool to kind of give everybody a peek behind the curtain into what I try to do before these episodes, so I know what I'm talking about, or at least give the appearance thereof. But I wanted to address something interesting that Tarantino says. Because Tarantino reveres this film so much. It's one of his, he's said repeatedly, top 5 films. But his chapter in cinema speculation is basically kind of him having an imaginary argument with Marty about things in Taxi Driver that he wanted to be different. And so it's kind of him, like, for all of his love of this film and for all of his respect for Scorsese that you can tell he has if you've listened to him talk, he's, like, bickering with the director about his movie in this book. And we can talk about the different details of that, but one thing that I wanted to pull out of that could kickstart some interesting conversation is that Tarantino thinks that Travis Bickle steals valor, that he is not, in fact, a Vietnam vet. Because we never actually get a direct either flashback or exchange with another character that validates that, yeah, he did go overseas and fight. The only thing we get is the scarring on him and his personal description of the fact that he was in Vietnam.
Interesting. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's an interesting possibility. I'd be curious to know if Scorsese deliberately left that ambiguous, or if that's just there was no need for a flashback. There was no need for a scene with a fellow veteran or whatever. Like, it just didn't fit, so it didn't occur to Schrader or Scorsese to put it in there.
From everything that Schrader's described in writing the film, it seems that in his mind he was an actual veteran, because there's at one point in, I think it's one of the bonus features, where he says Vietnam did not make him like this. He was like this before he went.
I remember that, yeah.
He'd always been like that. So I think, at least in Schrader's mind, he in fact did go to Vietnam, and that it, despite it not making him this way, it may have influenced him in certain elements and aspects of his personality.
Yeah, I think you're right. He doesn't give necessarily the appearance of the stereotypical Vietnam veteran, but I think that's sort of part of the point, that part of what made that war and several other wars that America's been involved in so much of a social uproot was the fact that these were just average Joes that got shipped off.
Well, I think
it wasn't
also
all people that we associate with, like, the macho army dude.
Yes, and I think Full Metal Jacket does a good job of displaying that, but also I think something to remember is that there are different types of Vietnam veterans. There are people who witnessed and experienced far different things from one another that were in the same war. Some men got away pretty clean. Some men saw some things that were pretty horrible. Some men did some things that were pretty horrible. And from the understanding that I have of the psychology of PTSD, witnessing something horrible can stay with you permanently as PTSD. The most horrible and personality-changing things are the things that you know you did that you never thought you'd be capable of doing. And then you come back to normalcy, or what we would consider normalcy in the US, and you then have to live with the memories that you did things that you never thought you could do. And I'd be interested to see where Travis fits in that continuum.
Yeah, it's interesting because he does, up to the point where he starts like getting back in shape and being like overtly violent. He gives the impression of being a fairly well integrated guy insofar as we don't see him having night terrors. We don't see him having bad flashbacks or episodes like that. He's not socially integrated, very much the opposite, but he
does have insomnia. Like he does at the very beginning
true,
of the
yeah.
film, he mentions that he can't sleep nights.
That's why he drives.
That's why he
at
drives.
night.
And we see him drinking a lot. Like, that's where I'm curious about where he is on the continuum, because it's clear that whether it's Vietnam or his own personality, he's definitely haunted by something.
Yeah.
And he is integrated in the sense that he is, despite being as lonely and alone as he is still functioning within the society of New York City.
He's functional and he can pass. Like, he
Yes.
can interact with people and give the appearance of a well-adjusted person more so than he is.
But can he? Because he
Up to a point.
Up to a point, I think.
Yeah.
He is able to pass with, what's her name again?
Betsy.
Betsy, yeah. He is able to pass with Betsy. He's able to put on the mask. He just can't uphold it.
Well, and once he takes off the mask, it's like, even with Wizard, their buddies, they for all Wizard knows, he's a normal enough guy until there's just that like little bit further degree of closeness between them when Travis kind of opens up more than he usually does, and Wizard realizes, oh, this guy's really messed up. So it's interesting. It's an interesting pattern, and you're right. I would be curious to hear from Schrader if I ever got to like meet him. Is he a guy that just saw a bunch of stuff and was traumatized, or is he a guy that was over there?
I will say something that I'm realizing that would be useful for us to do moving forward, and I think we could do it here if you're interested in taking the lead on it, is in terms of a structure for the podcast, it might be useful early on to give the audience watching a general understanding of what the movie is, what the plot is, things like that. Just a general summary, because I'm going to bet that not everybody who watches this has seen the film.
Okay.
So would you like to give a general summary of what the film is and then what the plot is for it?
I'd love to. So this is 1976, film by Martin Scorsese. It was part of his initial run where he took right off. He had done Mean Streets by this point. He was in the early stages of having the career that we know Scorsese to have, where he's churned out, with very few exceptions, a very consistent career of great films. And it was written by Paul Schrader. The two of them were introduced by Brian De Palma, whose name you recognize if you're familiar with that era. And Schrader had this experience of being lonely and isolated. He himself had insomnia. He himself felt disaffected and kind of a social outcast. And so he wrote this film drawing on his experiences. He gives it to Scorsese at De Palma's suggestion. Scorsese clicks with it right away, and they get Robert De Niro to star as Travis Bickle, who, as we've mentioned, is a Vietnam vet. He's back from the war, and he has insomnia, so he does the graveyard shift driving a cab in New York City. If you know New York City history at all, the 1970s were not a great time, especially for Times Square and some of the other places that now are very touristy. At that point were super crime-ridden, super dangerous, and we see Travis paradoxically being drawn to that while also passing judgment on it and feeling anger towards people that live a life he deems seedy or undesirable. And the essence of it is that through his different misadventures and the strange characters he meets, he eventually runs across an underage prostitute played by Jodie Foster, and she is sort of the catalyst for him acting on his anger towards these people he judges, and that explodes into a lot of violence, which is a generally unspoilerish way, I think, to describe the film. And if you haven't seen it, highly recommend. It's a classic. Like I mentioned, Tarantino and many other people regard it as a classic of American cinema. If you haven't seen it yet, stop the video, go watch it. It's worth your time. And come back once you have done so.
I think that is a great way to describe it. And yeah, I was just looking at a couple of the tech specs for later I will bring up. But yeah, so in relation to that, we will go back to our discussion about Travis's character, especially at the start of the film. You know, how do you feel he develops?
I think it's a development of escalating towards something that is probably inevitable. Pauline Kael, the film critic from The New Yorker for many years, described the film in sort of erotic terms, that there's this like build up and build up and build up, and then the climax of the film is the climax. And I think the way that it's laid out up to the point where he starts to try to help Iris, Jodie Foster's character, we see these encounters that feel random, and they feel just like they're sort of happenstance encounters. But I think the further you go through the film, you realize that these all are significant because they tip the scales a little bit from somebody that, despite being very odd and despite having strange tendencies, more or less lives a functional life, to somebody who has been pushed to the breaking point. So it's sort of this, like, if I would describe his character arc physically, it's sort of this straight diagonal downward, or perhaps a diagonal downward that is steps.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and I would agree with you. What do you think Betsy represents for Travis?
I think he represents the ideal he has of being able to reintegrate. She is the opposite. She's the antithesis of the world that he, as I described, is kind of like drawn to, but also looks down on. We don't see her do or say really anything that gives us reason to think she's anything other than a very wholesome, kind person. She, in fact, is a volunteer, if not employee, for a presidential campaign, a candidate who's running on a pro-social platform, in a sense. And I think in Travis's mind, he'd ideally be able to shut out the issues that he's been having as a result of the war, or as a result of himself, because, as Paul Schrader said, he had this stuff going on before the war. And with her and through her and their hopeful relationship, he's able to go back to normal. The problem is he doesn't behave like a person who's trying to go back to normal.
Yeah, I think that's valid. I think it's also, it's reminding me of something that Schrader said in the creation of the story about how he framed it as a very American story, in the sense that he believes other people in this world of other nationalities may turn inward when things start to go wrong, and may try and understand themselves a bit more. Whereas in America, there is this overwhelming tendency, not necessarily with everybody, but we see it a lot in a variety of different means, even still up to today, where people with internal problems will then externalize them and put them on to others. We see that with some of the tragedies that people commit, at random places at random times. This being one of them. I mean, this, realistically, this is an attempted mass shooting.
Yeah.
By Travis Bickle, both in the campaign circle and then redirected in a completely different area. Now, he thinks he's doing the right thing, and just by happenstance, he ends up doing what is considered the right thing. But again, something that Schrader says is, and I think even Martin agrees with this as well, he didn't choose to do the right thing. He chose to be violent. The only reason it was considered that he did the right thing is because he just happened to fail at the bad one and redirected to something that society would have been a bit more approving of.
So here's something interesting that Tarantino talks about that has to do with that. In Schrader's original script, everyone in the final shootout is black, including Harvey Keitel's and Murray Mauston's characters. Which, for Schrader, had the ring of realism as evidenced by when Harvey Keitel was trying to find a pimp to interview as preparation for the role. He couldn't find any white ones. And he's like, well, I'm playing a white pimp, so I need somebody. And he couldn't because that was a, unfortunately, black-dominated industry at that time. And the studio was like, no. Like, if we end this with a racist white dude shooting a bunch of black guys in a slum, there will be riots in the theaters. And Marty was like, okay, it's not a big deal. Like, whatever. We'll make them all white. I want to work with Keitel again anyway, so who cares? Tarantino thinks that was like a huge deal that the change happened. And he ascribes it to like what he calls societal compromise.
Well, Schrader even says that.
Yeah, so what he believes that it would have been more impactful for us to realize that he is a piece of shit, but we sort of are subconsciously rooting for him in a sense because he's the protagonist and we're following his direct POV. It would have been more impactful for us to be like, oh yeah, like go rescue Iris, and then he kills like a dozen black guys, and then you're like, oh my god, what was I rooting for this whole time?
Here's my biggest problem with that is I think if that had happened, if they had kept the original ending, the movie would have gotten a lot more popular with all of the wrong people for all of the wrong reasons.
Which is crazy to say about a movie that is very popular with all of the wrong people for very wrong reasons.
But that's the thing is, because it didn't let itself, whether it was Schrader and Marty realizing they couldn't do that or the studio imposing that on them, they had the social understanding that there's a certain responsibility with what you do.
Yes.
And if they did that, if they were allowed to do that, it would have been probably still today, one of the biggest dog whistles of all time. And I genuinely think that probably would have had a negative turn for history in this country.
I don't disagree, and it would really, there's that aspect of it would have had political implications and social implications for people that found wish fulfillment in that.
It arguably would have been the 70s version of A Birth of a Nation.
I was just about to invoke Birth of a Nation because it would suck a lot for this film to be tainted in the same way Birth of a Nation is, where Birth of a Nation was a tremendous feat cinematically for the time. D.W. Griffith was a great director, and the scale of what he did in that, in Intolerance, was in all ways pertaining to the production of a movie estimable. People are going to yell at me for saying that because he is associated rightfully with extraordinary racism and white supremacy. It would really suck for a film this great to have that stain on it.
I would not be shocked if they also recognized that at the time.
Yeah.
Where, even if not in a conscious manner, some part of them recognized if we did that, this movie would suffer because it would be in that same vein.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's I question Schrader a little bit based on the fact that detail is in the script and that he described that he wanted that scene to feel like a samurai death, and he wanted to have like blood spatter all over the walls, and like he it seems like some of his disaffection and some of his some interesting beliefs he might have kind of bled into that a little bit, unfortunately.
Well, so I agree with you, but I think it's interesting because we can tie that directly back to the situation he was in when he wrote it, because in the interviews since, he directly references racism being a result of people on the bottom of the totem pole refusing to recognize their position in society, so they have to put somebody beneath them.
Yep.
And when you're that low and you're that desperate, you start to become so tribal that something as meaningless as skin color becomes a dividing factor that you can then subvert someone else beneath you. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, because he says that in like the 90s when they do the mini doc about it behind the scenes. But at the time he was writing, he had just destroyed a marriage and had been kicked out of the apartment of the woman that he destroyed the marriage with. He was living in his car. He was in the hospital because of, I think it was an ulcer. Like, he was at the bottom of the totem pole at that point. I wouldn't be shocked if some of the elements in the original screenplay are a direct result of the socioeconomic situation he's describing that racism comes from. I wouldn't be shocked if, I'm not going to call him a racist through and through, but in that moment, in that period of desperation, part of this therapeutic process for him, which he says the screenwriting was for him at the time, devolved into that tribalism, that he was gaining some level of catharsis, as Travis was, from creating a sense of justice in a society as dark as it was, from a position as dark as it was even for him at the time, living the life of Travis Bickle. And I wouldn't be shocked if, as time has gone on and life has gotten better for him, if part of the reason he felt the need to put that out into the world verbally during the documentaries 20-some years later, that he started to recognize what he had done in the original screenwriting, why he had done it, and he had to reconcile that with himself.
I think you're spot on. And to be clear for the audience, we're not saying that you can't write a racist character. Like, there's a problem in our parasocial world of people thinking that because a fictional person with certain moral flaws came out of the creative person's brain, that that's somehow downstream of who they are. That's not the case. You can write, Andrew Kevin Walker is not a serial killer because he wrote Seven, obviously. You can write Travis Bickle without holding any of his beliefs. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting in terms of understanding the film more fully to see, okay, where did this guy actually live some of these experiences? And in being an imperfect person, how did he draw upon the flaws that he may have had? And it does seem pretty clear, you're right, that that helped him recognize the trajectory he was on was bad, and recognize what his blind spots were as a human being. And it seems clear that was a positive thing for him to write this and externalize what was roiling in here. And it seems like he came out the other side better for it.
At the very least, as far as we can tell publicly.
Definitely.
But yeah, so we talked a lot about character, a lot about story. Is there any other context that you want to go through about either the film or the time that it came out in?
Yeah, the one thing that was interesting was the French influence on this, which is fascinating to juxtapose with what we were just talking about, given that part of Paul Schrader's quote that you alluded to was that if this film happened in France, what does he say? Like, Travis Bickle would have done something.
Would have internalized his problems more than externalized them onto other people violently.
Right. And you can see that. Like, if you've watched French films of the time, in the French New Wave era and such, you can see how that culture is very much like, oh, I'm going to get very self-absorbed and internal, and I'm going to be very dramatic about it, but I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to sit there with it. It's interesting that difference between the way that this character would act in that culture versus this one, given that this is a very French-influenced film. Schrader and Scorsese screened Pickpocket by Bresson, The Fire Within by Louis Malle. They drew upon Godard and Truffaut and other French filmmakers of that era, as many people did in America in the 70s. So it's fascinating that they took a lot of the like style of production in terms of the run and gun type shooting. They took individual shots, like the aspirin dissolving shot, which is a Godard homage. What was the other one? Oh, when he soaks his food in peach liqueur, that's a Robert Bresson homage. They took all that stuff and said, okay, we're going to do that, but we're going to make it authentically American and authentically New York. And so it doesn't feel like a ripoff. It feels like somebody that they were seeing the strengths of this type of storytelling that was not being done here yet. Or it was in the sense that there were a lot of what Andrew Sarris called revenge-omatics. Like, that was a common genre here. But to take such a European approach to it, but preserve the Americanness of it is fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really interesting blend, and I think it lends itself to being a universal film because, from what I recall, I think Schrader was saying that it did surprisingly well internationally.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason for that is because it has some of those, despite Travis's actions being very inherently American and it being a very inherently New York story, there are those elements of the French, internalization, even just in moments. And then obviously it did incredibly well in New York, despite the fact that it's not the greatest picture of New York, but I think kind of like how modern day Philadelphians look at Philly as a place that once was, that I think is now kind of becoming again. Back in the 2000s, people were not proud of being from Philly outside of living in Philly proper because we love it because it sucks.
Yeah.
But now, for whatever reason, Philadelphia is getting a lot of attention again in positive ways.
It seems to be, I think, the confluence of a resurgence of the area around Philly, even in towns like ours, where that's happened. The fact that we've gotten, I think, more national attention because we actually have a competent football team these days, and the fact that a lot of people in New York, professionals in New York, are emigrating.
Yeah, we do have a lot of
living
people...
is it has proximity to New York. It is, there are a lot of things about the city that are reminiscent, much lower cost of living.
Yes, well, we also have a lot of people over around Route 30 that have commuted to New York for a long time via the train. Like, even multiple people I went to high school with, their parents every morning rode the train to New York and then came back here. Yeah.
Gotta love a 2-hour commute.
Yeah, but when it's a train and you don't have to worry about driving, it's a lot easier. Also, some of those people that were commuting were not necessarily doing desk jobs. Some of those people that were commuting were doing a little bit higher tier things. I won't name names or anything, but like it's the type of lifestyle where you're not coming home to a apartment doing that per se. It's a little bit on the other side of the spectrum.
Oh, you're talking about like well, wait, are you connoting like the mob, or are you connoting like Upper East Side, like independently wealthy type?
That kind of vibe.
Got it, okay.
You're still working, but you're not coming home to an apartment. You're coming home to an estate.
Got it. Okay.
So yeah, you're borderline capable of taking a helicopter to work in New York every day.
Incredible.
Yeah. But that being said, I do think before we dive into anything further technical and whatnot, I do think do we want to talk a little bit more about the socioeconomic implications of this story? Because I know one of the things about Travis versus Betsy is that there is a little bit of that mentality there. I know that Marty liked the idea of Betsy being waspy in the sense not only physically, but also the way she acts, the way she dresses. She's clearly of a different economic class than Travis currently is.
Sure. I do want to sneak in though, because that we'll spend some time on that and then go technical. Just a brief thing. Paul Schrader gave an interview with IndieWire in 2013, where he said that in his mind, Travis Bickle dies within 6 months of the ending.
Interesting.
I don't know what you think about that.
You know, I feel like it makes sense, and it makes sense because of the sting and the look in the mirror at the end of the film, in which we get the implication, and Marty in the bonus features very explicitly communicates that is intending the idea that the time bomb has begun ticking again, that he has not reached self-actualization as a result of this film. He has vented off pressure that has once again started building again. And in a person in which that occurs, there are two options. One, you seek help and you find a healthy outlet. Two, either that or just in one way, shape, or form, you explode.
Yeah.
And whether that's taking it upon yourself or putting yourself into a situation like that of the end of the film, in which you're not as lucky, in which you're not as prepared for, in which maybe you have a little bit of complacency, you have a little bit of arrogance about your ability, especially considering what you just put yourself through.
Well, that's the thing, is that he does get super lucky in that he has the opportunity to redirect out of a attempted assassination of a presidential candidate, which ends his life either literally or in terms of a life sentence in prison, and redirects it to he catches a bunch of guys quite literally with their pants down, and because everybody hates those people, he suffers no consequences. I could very easily see his next go of it being something that he can't get off scot-free.
Especially considering even in that final battle, he gets shot in the neck.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like he even gets off scot-free. He gets off scot-free consequence-wise in relation to the police, but, like, he gets injured. I think he gets shot more than once.
Yeah.
And he thinks, not only does he think he's going to die in the end, but he also actively tries to take his life. He just so happens to have run out of ammunition. And I think realistically, that experience got him some sense of peace. But it's fleeting, and he wants it again. And considering the actions he took in the final battle of this film, I would only imagine he would do the same thing next time. So the idea that he is dead within 6 months of the end of this film is not surprising in the slightest. I think it makes a lot of sense for the character that was built in this film.
Definitely. No, let's talk about money.
Money, yeah. So what about money do you want to talk about?
You were the one who introduced this topic. You should start.
Money in terms of, like, budgeting?
No, you're talking about how class plays into how.
Oh,
economic
yes.
class plays
Sorry,
into this,
went a little bit production design with money.
Oh yeah, no, we'll talk about
production
that
side.
money later.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because Marty even references it, and it's part of the reason why he cast Betsy, is she is of a socioeconomic class that is definitively higher than Travis. Not only that, but she's also clearly more educated, all of these different things. You can read into it as much as you want. There are things to be said about the fact that she is a young, attractive, well-off woman that's helping with a political campaign. That in and of itself kind of signifies who would be capable of doing that in her position. Interesting dynamic there.
Right, and that character definitely could have been a politically active supporter of a more radical politician in the 70s. That would not have been out of place.
Mm-hmm.
She is, I think, very deliberately supporting somebody who is a comfortably, if not too much so, within the Overton window of American politics. She doesn't seem to have any strongly held ideas that rock the boat. She seems like she supports the current thing, as the kids say.
This feels like, for her character, this feels like a either Upper East Side or suburban young woman who is now deciding to do her equivalent of joining the Peace Corps.
That's a great point, is that because this is an obviously national election, she's not even necessarily a real New Yorker. She may well be from Hoboken or Points West, for example, or upstate, who is just here because that's where the campaign headquarters was established.
Exactly. And it seems like she's borderline doing this for college credit, or maybe more so this is, like I said, a step in the right direction for her, life-wise.
Yeah, she may have aspirations to work in politics.
Or even just, this seemed like something worth doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, putting yourself in the mind frame of somebody at that time of her position. This is her form of rebellion, possibly, where she grew up in a very safe environment, and she grew up in a very politically muted environment per se, or let's say. And for that type of individual, this is that type of rebellion where I'm going to the big city and I'm going to support a political campaign. And the reason why I'm making this analogy is because this is the perfect representation of somebody who is still incredibly sheltered that is looking for rebellion. Because, yes, New York City is, especially at that time, a rough spot. But it's very clear in the film that she doesn't go to the rough spots of New York. She doesn't she doesn't engage with that element and lifestyle of the city. She keeps to her area of the city, which is probably the least like New York of New York at that time.
Yeah.
And also, I like your comment about the political campaign that she chose, because it's not a really revolutionary campaign. This is probably the most, white bread kind of political campaign, kind of political, individual that she could have represented, that she could have assisted. But that's the point.
So I'm curious, the 1976 presidential election in real life was between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was the incumbent.
Mm-hmm.
I think this guy's Ford.
Really?
I don't know that I see Carter in this guy, Palatine.
I think the way I see Carter is the fact that it's not a huge deviation from the norm. Is that he's a smiling face with very little substance.
Well, and he is not the incumbent, so I guess that puts a point towards Carter in general.
Yeah.
I think the reason why my gut goes to Ford is that he does feel like a conservative-coded character. At the very least, Betsy is.
Yeah.
But also Jimmy Carter was also pretty conservative by today's standards as well, despite being a Democrat. So I see your point there.
And I'm curious.
But he does also too feel like even though he's not the incumbent, he feels like a continuity type candidate. Like he feels like a guy that's like, I'm going to keep everything the way it is.
Yes.
That feels very much his sales pitch.
Yeah, it's I'm going to keep things the way it is, but also like we're going to have change, but we're going to have kind of unsaid, minimal and generally non-rocking the boat change.
There's going to be change. It's not going to feel like change because we're not going to be super passionate about it.
Okay, I was trying to remember. For whatever reason, I had it in my mind that at one point Betsy was even wearing pearls to kind of go with your point that she is a bit conservative coded, but she has what seems like a chain necklace on at one point and then some scarves. So, slight misremembering there.
Conservative coded and the type of conservative specifically that doesn't really know what else to be. I think the way that she reacts to the porno theater is very specific because she doesn't get there and go, "Hey, dude, I'm not watching this. What the hell are you doing? I'm not freaking going in there." She's like, hey, "Travis, come on, this is a dirty movie. I don't like these kind. Okay, I don't really like the. All right," and she kind of like goes along to get along at first and then leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody that's like really acquainted with the real world, regardless of ideology, is a little bit more comfortable in their own skin of being like, "No, I don't like this stuff." I'm like, I'm not doing this.
Mm-hmm.
You're weird for even suggesting it.
Yeah, it's definitely, it lends itself to the idea of that sheltered element. Now, this is a question I have that I'm curious about. Obviously, and Marty in interviews and stuff kind of says this, but Travis is attracted to her because she is what he is not. Do we feel like that's a common thread that we see in other films? Or is this something unique to this movie?
Yes. I think it's a common thing for Scorsese because...
For Scorsese in particular?
Yes.
Okay, tell me more.
The thing that he keeps coming back to, in the last episode that we recorded, we talked about Killers of the Flower Moon, and that fits into a trend of a lot of Scorsese films about taking a guy who is fairly normal, fairly straightforward, and through pursuing his greed, he destroys his life and the life of people around him. what goes along with that for Scorsese is his protagonists tend to be driven towards women that are not with that. I'm thinking of
this film,
Ray Liotta's wife in Goodfellas. Naomi in Wolf of Wall Street. I'm thinking of Molly Burkhart in Killers of the Flower Moon. And I don't know if I know off the top of my head why that's something that's big for Scorsese. He has not had a stable romantic life. He's been married like 4 or 5 times. If you just look at the personal life section on his Wikipedia page, it's a lot of like, well, he was married to this woman, and then he was on a movie with this other woman, and so he left his wife for her, and then they saw each other for 4 years.
To be fair, that happens a lot in
and
Hollywood.
Then he worked for another. Oh, of course it does. It's just interesting that that's been 50 consistent years for Scorsese.
So this brings up an interesting element, because I was reading "You Will Never Eat Lunch in This Town Again" by Julia Phillips, who is part of the Phillips couple that produced this film, and it's an interesting book because Julia Phillips. She's no longer with us. She died of cancer back in the 2000s. She kind of tanked her entire career, particularly right after this on producing Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Because when she and Michael got to Hollywood, they made a lot of friends. They did very well. The Sting was their first and big success. And they had a couple of films after that. But by the time Close Encounters was happening, and she was working with Spielberg...
Which, for context, came out the year after Taxi Driver.
Yes. She and Spielberg had a good relationship. But she was also heavily addicted to cocaine.
Yeah.
And started her slide into crack cocaine. To a point where she and Michael split years prior to Close Encounters. Not many years, but a few years prior. They were working on split custody with their child. And she ended up starting to hang out with her dealer more, even though at the time, internally, she was kind of against it. But things kept happening. And at one point, he was on location with her in, I think it was New Mexico, as they were filming Close Encounters, and something, I can't remember exactly what it was, but something bad happened, and Steven was just kind of like, Julia, you got to get your shit together. Yeah. And there was a series of instances like that, and there were a couple of times where she attempted to, and she did, but it's one of the unfortunate situations where it was a little bit too little too late, and when the film went over time and over budget, she became the scapegoat. Not without reason, unfortunately, because she was one of the major producers, and she was responsible for that, and she did let things fall through the cracks. Now, obviously, there are elements of like, well, you need to be able to have forgiveness and things like that, but Hollywood's a cutthroat industry, and she did not reform after that. And the downside of that being is that after that, she slid into heavier addiction tendencies, spent all of her money over the course of the next decade and a half, essentially on drugs, and was not able to claw her way back until she wrote that book, got a little bit of a semblance of notoriety again. But it's very clear in the book that she has a lot of regrets about that time, and especially where she ended up as a result of that, to the point where she writes in the first person about her life from childhood up until Close Encounters. And she writes in the third person about where she currently is.
Interesting.
And I think it's because she is so displeased with how her life turned out and the action she chose and where she found herself, that she doesn't even like to recognize the fact that it's her life.
Damn.
Which just sucks. It's sad, but it's a really good... The book had a lot of good insights into a number of the people in this world. And I think one of the interesting things about Scorsese that she mentions, especially about what we're talking about, is he kind of comes right out and says that the reason he wanted Sybil Shepherd was because there's an element to her that he recognized as being something of interest to him when he was growing up in Little Italy.
Yeah.
because she represented something that he wasn't, that he never was. That waspy blonde was of another world. And it was the epitome of, for, young Scorsese, growing up in that part of New York, was so otherworldly. It was the epitome of that which I don't have, I want.
That's really fascinating, given that in all the films, the Big Book here, it talks about how De Niro has generally been Scorsese's go-to to put himself in a movie.
Mm.
They have virtually identical backgrounds. They were generally in each other's orbit, even just from a young age. They just know each other personally. It's interesting that what you say, Sybil Shepherd, there's something about her that interests him because he's casting her opposite this person that he is more similar to Schrader of the two, but in Scorsese's casting of De Niro, Scorsese clearly also identifies with. And I could see mapping that onto the other examples throughout his career of feeling like he has this obsession, he has this thing that he's willing to liquidate his life over, and this string of him trying to pull someone along for the ride as a partner, but her inevitably going like, yeah, what the hell kind of life is this?
I think the greatest epitome of that, at least in the films that I've seen of his, is probably Wolf of Wall Street. I think there's a reason he gravitated to that story. And I can understand that. We all have desire within ourselves, and we all need to reconcile that because, it's natural to be curious about the world and whatnot. But I think every individual has different internal struggles, and they also have different levels of that struggle. I think there are some people that once they're with a partner, never think about the possibility of being with anyone else.
Yeah.
And then I think there are some people probably at the very other end of the spectrum where, the greatest end of the spectrum is the self-realization that I can never be with a partner because I know I don't have the capacity to be monogamous for my entire life. I can't do it. I don't have that self-control. And then you have somewhere in the middle where you've got people who, are happy with their partner but might have a bit of a wandering eye, and maybe they don't like that about themselves, and, maybe they're like, look but don't touch, I'll be okay, something like that. Maybe you have a step further where people are like, I'm happy with my partner, but I can't help but, everyone that walks by, I'm like, oh, what if that's the right person? What if that's the right person? They just, there is some level of unfulfillment. Even in the most fulfilling relationship that you could possibly think of, there's always going to be that I want what I don't have. And then you might even be able to take it a step further in the sense of like, the people who actively do go and cheat on their partners, where it's less about a longing for any form of companionship. It's more an uncontrollable lust. They can't look. They understand that the partner that they're with is the person they should be with, but they can't help themselves. They don't have that willpower or that self-recognition or that I don't want to call it repression, but the ability to recognize, hey, the consequences to me doing this are not worth the thrill of doing it. Or again, one step further, they are worth it.
Yeah.
Because despite this being a secure relationship, I'm not happy with it. I'm going to do what I want. And again, that is a increasing level of unhealthy and disrespectful. But I do think there are a lot of levels that exist within that continuum on any vice. It could be gambling. It could be, really any other addiction. It could be anger. It could be, a tendency towards violence. It could be anything that would be considered a flaw within humanity. I just think the most applicable one here is lust.
Yeah.
And I think whether or not we know if or where on that continuum Scorsese is, at the very least, he really likes to play with that continuum. Mm-hmm. He likes to explore what it means to be someone who may be in a relationship that is unfulfilling and have a desire that you can't control, such as with Wolf of Wall Street. Or someone not in a relationship who maybe has that desire not necessarily just out of a primal urge, but also a deep-seated unfulfillment, a deep-seated recognition that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah. In addition to the idea of, oh, I just can't help myself, it's also this, like, these are people that get caught up in a world that affords them a lot of opportunities, whether that's the mob or whether that's Wall Street, where he has what feels like all the money in the world and women are throwing themselves at him. I could see Scorsese. I could see those being kind of a parallel to the fact that he went from such a troubled upbringing, not only from a class standpoint, but also from the standpoint of he was asthmatic. He spent much more time indoors as a kid than his peers. He was in a very religious community to the point of doing some studies towards becoming a priest. He then goes from that into getting swept up in this world where he is one of the most revolutionary and acclaimed filmmakers of his generation from a comparatively young age. He doesn't have a blank check by this point at Taxi Driver, but he's already impressed a lot of people with Mean Streets and such. When you're caught up in the dynamism and the sexiness and the excitement of that world, the things that are important to you and you feel like your commitments and obligations are of your old life start to feel like they don't matter, because what matters to you now is this bigger world that's opened up to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth and validity to that. And I think also, despite the fact that, we've been talking about the relationship aspect of it, I think that is also apparent in this film in particular, not so much in Wall Street, but in this film, that relinquishing yourself to violent tendencies as well. That, as we brought up a moment ago, that is another vice. And I think that's something that maybe is intentional or not, it's a foil to the relational desire with Betsy, where when that fails, he kind of slingshots to the other end of it. Of, if I can't have love, I will fight.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting element there. So I think we've done a great job of dissecting the story and some of the elements there. Are there any final thoughts on that before we go to a little bit more of a technical discussion of the film?
Yeah, I just love some of the anecdotes. There's a book called Easy Riders, Raging Bulls by Peter Biskind that is generally considered not very reliable. It opens up a lot of the unseemly sides of the New Hollywood era, and pretty much every major figure that is discussed in that book has condemned it roundly. But there is the funny story that, according to the book, all of the guns actually do belong to Stephen Prince. They were just his personal weapons he brought to the set for that scene.
I believe that. I think I've heard that elsewhere as well.
Knowing, having seen American Boy and knowing Stephen Prince, that's not the most ludicrous thing that Biskind wrote. So that's great. There was an aborted video game adaptation in 2005.
Really?
It was some sort of GTA style.
Interesting.
But they quickly were like, no, we're not doing that. When the studio told Scorsese to cut the film down for an R rating, because it originally got an X, he just lost it. He started telling people he was going to kill studio executives. He hid the reels so the studio couldn't take them, and tried to conspire with United Artists to release it without Columbia's permission, which is super illegal. Yeah, what was the other? Yeah, Tarantino talks about how this is basically The Searchers, which is a John Ford film with John Wayne about a guy who feels the same way about the Comanche people that Travis does towards black people, and he has to rescue his niece from the Comanches. Scorsese's doing a version of that. There are a lot of parallels between Ethan Edwards, John Wayne's character, and Travis, parallels between the niece and Iris. So that's fairly interesting. Scorsese is a big Dostoevsky fan. He actually had wanted Schrader to write an adaptation of The Gambler for him, which was Dostoevsky's book processing his roulette addiction. That ended up not happening, but this movie is super influenced by Notes from Underground, which involves a nameless first-person narrator who similarly very disaffected socially and ends up encountering a young prostitute and other stuff that is paralleled here. Neither Pauline Kael nor Tarantino liked the score. They were like, Pauline Kael was like, yeah, Bernard Herrmann died right after. It's a shame the score wasn't better. Which is crazy because it's a great score, so I don't know what they're on. Last one was that there was a third producer in addition to the Phillips. The Phillipses, who was Tony Bill, and he quit as soon as they fired Jeff Bridges. Because it was originally set up with, I think his name's Robert Milligan directing, and Jeff Bridges was going to star, and then once they were like, no, we're not going with Jeff Bridges, Tony Bill was like, I'm out.
Interesting, because Tony was a partner of the Phillipses. He was one of the people who got them kind of into the business, and they worked together with him. So I'd be curious to know more about that.
Big Jeff Bridges guy, apparently.
Apparently, yeah.
I already talked a little bit about the critical discussion of this. Pauline Kael took a really sex-focused analysis of the whole thing. Roger Ebert called her out by name because she did not like the payphone dolly into the empty hallway.
Really?
Yeah, and so she was like, this is self-indulgent. Scorsese's up his own ass, basically. And Roger Ebert, name-checked her and was like, that's a dumb take. What are you talking about? He talked about something called the priest-eye view shot, which is...
Who did?
Ebert.
Okay.
And it's... I've never heard it called this, but it's a shot that's approximately from eye level down at stuff on a table. And Ebert compares it to... It's the point of view of a priest looking down at the elements of a mass.
Interesting.
You see that with the guns. You see that with other things in the film. Interesting.
It's an interesting phraseology for that.
Right, yeah. Phraseology given Scorsese's background and the fact that he's very preoccupied with Catholicism.
Yep.
Ebert's co-host Gene Siskel hated it. He was like, this is way too violent. The last third sucks. He's like, I looked away from the violence, which I think is him being dramatic.
Yes.
He makes a ridiculous comment, though, which is that he wanted to see more of the Travis-Betsy relationship portrayed in a positive light. And Ebert's like, you want him to just make a different movie?
Yeah.
What the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, just go watch something else.
Exactly. So that's that. Those are the last few stories I picked up on. Let's go technical.
Perfect. So, do you have questions for me? Considering I covered a lot of the technicality elements in the original Silver Retention video, which, if you have not seen that, please go check it out.
Well, we can start with something that I have a little bit of familiarity with, and then you can go deep into your niche of this. But a lot of the process of the production and the techniques, Scorsese is borrowing a lot from the French New Wave, which was a movement after World War II, where you had a lot of people writing about cinema. Godard, Truffaut, Agnes Varda. They were like, well, what? We can just do this. And so they start making their own work, and it is both heavily influenced by American films like John Ford, who I mentioned earlier, and then also turns around and influences back the New Hollywood era in America. And so Scorsese is really into this. And so a lot of the run and gun, guerrilla, permanentless shooting, a lot of the dynamism of camera movement, that you see in this time and in this film, is borrowed there. And it pissed off the crew a lot because they were like, what is this unorthodox shit you're doing? You're crazy. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are on just the way that he approached the camera work in the film.
Well, so a lot of that has to do with his relationship with the cinematographer, who was Michael Chapman. And it was interesting because I can't remember where I read the interview. It might have been in Masters of Light. I think it was, actually. Chapman was discussing the fact that Marty, even more so than what we see in the final film, just was obsessed with moving the camera. And it was probably likely from a lot of what you were describing, because original, Westerns in Hollywood and Ford movies and stuff like that, they don't move the camera a ton. Usually it's locked off, both for technical reasons and also just for their stylistic purposes. So Chapman discusses in Masters of Light the fact that almost every scene they shot a version of it with the camera moving on a dolly. even if in the final film it wasn't.
Interesting.
Yes. And that got a little annoying for the crew and for him, but one of the things that he appreciated, and one of the things that he recognized the crew appreciated, is that Marty's willingness to push the boundaries, to ask for things that were unusual. There was a way he did it that made him charming, that made the crew want to help him do it. And Julia Phillips says the same thing about him overall in her book, that Marty just has a characteristic about his personality that allows him to persuade people to do things that they initially don't want to do in a way that makes them genuinely want to do it. Not have an obligation to him, but as a challenge for them, a creative possibility for them to attain. And I think that's a really interesting and valuable element of learning about how this film was done and how Scorsese works. He doesn't do it through command. He doesn't do it through requirement. He does it through posing a question that he knows that you're going to want to answer. And that was something that Chapman recognized he was doing with the crew, and the crew themselves recognized was happening. They weren't manipulated. They were motivated. And I found that really interesting because there are a lot of times on set where you're going to run into a situation where you want something that people don't want to do, even if they're enthusiastic about the project. But maybe you're at hour 8 of 12. Lunch was a little late, people are sluggish, and at this point, people are ready to go home. You know, you've done a lot of takes of something early in the day, people are just kind of fed up with it, they're tired, maybe it's the end of the week, and you want them to do an overhead dolly shot from a crane, looking down on a group of people. And the crew looks at you and says, it is going to take us 3 hours to rig this. By the time we're done with that, we're going to have 45 minutes left to shoot. This is a take that each individual take is going to be over a minute long. This is a very technical situation. Nobody can be up on that crane to look through the viewfinder, so you're going to have to do it by monitor. Do you trust your focus puller? Do you trust the rigging team? How are we going to do the lighting for this? We understand that the lighting plan exists, but we weren't anticipating doing this shot at this point in the day. So we have to redo the lighting plan because we're 2 hours behind schedule for what we intended, and now the lights have to be lit differently in order to properly do the shot that you want to do. We actually have to throw a tarp up on the west side of this shot to prevent the light from spilling over from the sun, considering that this is supposed to be in cloud cover. This is just a fictional, idea of a shot that I've just created. But obviously, that's a lot of issues that you have to solve. That's a lot of issues that you're asking the crew to solve. That's a lot of work you're asking them to do in a situation they don't want to do it.
And a project like this, that's just Tuesday.
Exactly. Well, on a lot of films, that's just Tuesday.
Unless you're like a Marvel movie that's all on green screen and you have all the money in the world, you're gonna run into, and even those films I'm sure have some kind of practical obstacles they need to solve in their own way. But you add that this is on location. They have they do have a finite budget that is not super high for the time. You're working with a director who is very inspiring, but has a vision that is abnormal for what a lot of these old hats in the crew are used to. You compound all those things together, and that is a breeding ground for even more complications than you would have on a very easy day, on an easy project.
And this is something that when I got an opportunity to meet Roger Deakins a few years ago when he was doing his book tour, I asked him about this directly. I said, at your level, I understand that, especially for us who are young, we're doing productions that are very small. You now have multiple Oscars. You now have been on some massive projects with some really good stars and directors. Do you get any more leeway at that point in your career? Like, you are one of the peak cinematographers. Most people would consider you the greatest, even though I know you're very humble because he was struggling with the compliments throughout the day. And I said, it was like, are you able, do you still have to make as many compromises like that? And his response was just to laugh, and he just said, every day. Every single day. There is always something multiple times a day that has to be compromised. And usually it involves whether it's an external factor or a producer coming up to me and not knowing what we're doing.
Yeah, what was that story about the producer that or the executive that he told you?
Yeah, so it was literally just a brief anecdote within that answer to the question that I asked, that there are still times where a producer will come up and ask him, why are we doing this? And he will explain, well, this is, it's a jib shot. We have to do this, that, whatever. And the producer will be like, well, what's a jib? Why do we need a jib? What does it do? And he will look at them and not say anything and wonder, how in God's name are you on this production? And when it gets really bad, he has to walk away, and then James has to come in and communicate with them because there's a certain point that he can't take anymore. And it was one of those moments where it was disappointing but relieving to me, because it made me realize, almost all of the modern world considers you to be the greatest cinematographer that's living. And you still have to deal with the exact same problems that everybody does, even on student-level films. So it never gets better. This is it.
Yeah.
Like, we're there. And it also kind of made me feel better about the fact it's like, okay, the only benefit to working on larger productions is you get more talented people. That's it.
Yeah.
The budgets just allow you to have more talent and more tools to play with.
And people are the most expensive thing on set, right?
Absolutely.
So the money gets you, it gets you nicer cameras. It might get you cooler locations or whatever, bigger sets. But fundamentally, the money is paying for you to have the people.
Yes. Yeah, it's paying for the talent. And that was kind of relieving for me in the sense of like, okay, so realistically, what I should be focusing on is the same thing you are focusing on, which is making the most of what you have.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want talent, find it. Because you can't afford the name talent right now.
Yeah.
There's plenty of talent out there. So go find it. Go work with them. Continue to work with them. And if you have talent and you make the most of what you have and you recognize your limitations, don't go out trying to make a period film as like a student filmmaker. You don't have the budget for it to look good.
My first short film was a period piece.
Well, but that's the thing is, did you learn why that was a bad idea?
Yeah, it was. Yes, I did. I had to encounter things like, how do I shoot around a stop sign? I had to deal with, oh shit, there's an electrical outlet in that shot. I didn't notice that on the day. Wouldn't recommend it for other people.
And that's the thing is, like, if you're going into it essentially as an exercise to figure out the amount of things you need to figure out on the day,
well, and
that works.
Absolutely, and it was also an exercise for me in trying to figure out if I could parse out the style. It was noir.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an exercise of me of like, can I parse out what makes noir in a way that I can demonstrate that I understand genre and I understand the techniques that go along with it. So it was a blast. I'm proud of it as being my first attempt to direct anything. But you're absolutely right. There's a reason why most people don't do that.
Exactly. And that's the thing is, like, it's not about not being capable of doing it. It's recognizing your own limitations. Mm-hmm. It's that if you really want to sell it, but you don't have the money for the production design to sell it or the costuming to sell it, maybe you recognize, okay, maybe this is something that I do when I have the ability to do it. Mm-hmm. And you recognize, okay, I currently have a budget of $5,000. If I pull everything I have to make it work, 3 of that is going to go to gear. 2 of that is going to go to talent. 1 of that is going to go to crew.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's 2 to 1 or 1 to 3, depending on how much gear you have, how big your crew is, things like that, how many shooting days you're doing. And then you sit there and you think, okay, well, that's what I have to work with. What's a story that I can create where I don't have to worry as much about costuming and production design? Or what's a story that I can create where I don't have to pay for locations? And that, to me, is the epitome of short filmmaking. is you look at what you can control, and then you write for what you can't.
Yeah.
To me, that makes you a better screenwriter because it makes you realize what your limitations are and then allows for that creativity to blossom within the sandbox that you've created for yourself.
Limitations make you more creative.
They do, 100%. Now, as you advance in your career, you get bigger budgets. You then can allow yourself to write bigger stories. Like, I have a outline for a period piece. And I didn't realize it until this conversation, it's a very Scorsese-esque film.
Is this the train one?
It is, yeah. And like that takes place in both New York and Chicago in the late 1920s, on trains that are moving at 120 miles an hour,
Famously
in rail
a
yards.
very cost-efficient thing
Exactly,
to shoot.
exactly. And that's the thing is like, I know I can't make that anytime in the next 20 years. If I'm lucky. If I ever get to a point that I could make it, it's probably going to be about 20 years from now, because that would require, in today's money, probably $200 million minimum to make it right.
My mind just goes to, you have to basically steal all your shots from just existing trains and then do all your interiors on sets.
Yes.
They don't look very convincing.
And that's the thing is like, if I want to do it right, I can't do it that way.
Yeah.
That's just, I recognize that until I reach that budget level, I cannot make that film.
Yeah. But you can be ambitious within your means. Like you can say, all right, we have the lodge. We have access to this. We can shoot whatever we want here. You can write something that is shootable in this building.
Yes.
And stretch yourself to the limits of what you're capable of while also staying on schedule and under budget. And that's really what it comes down to, is that it's not that you have to do something that's safe or do something that doesn't challenge you as a filmmaker. You just need to keep in mind the fact that there are, in addition to artistic concerns, pragmatic concerns. And if you start off undisciplined about time and money, those are not good habits to carry with you into the industry when you start competing for like actual directorial endeavors.
And that's really kind of what I'm hyper-focusing on here, is that those are the challenges you should force yourself to start with. Mm-hmm. Because if you can control all of the other aspects, and even within that, you're going over time and over budget, it shows that you weren't ready to make that period piece. You weren't ready to make that blockbuster. Only once you can control for production design, costuming, locations, and you can get under time and under budget with that, that's when you start pushing the boundary. That's when you say, all right, let's go to some exteriors. Let's hire a costume designer. Get a little bit more specific about this. Because then you have not only more details in the story, but you also have more questions you have to have answers to, which means you have to know your story even more than you thought you did before. Because there are going to be questions that your costume designer asks. It's like, okay, well, why do you want plaid instead of striped? You have to know the answer to that. You have to look at them and say, because I want them to embody more chaos in their character visually. Stripes are too organized. They are too distracting. The plaid is a little more subtle. It's also more chaotic. It's also more together. They're overlapping each other, which means that there is a cohesion there. Stripes are too clinical. That may be the reason. That may not be. There may be other reasons. That's just what comes to my mind when I create that scenario and the potential fictional character that's applying to. But that's the thing is like, again, it's like, why are we doing cerulean instead of navy? Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, well, maybe it's because this is a bright character. This is somebody who needs to embody positivity. Navy's a bit more constricted. They're a little bit more depressed or repressed or something like that. Like these little details of not just what you think, but you also have to take in mind your ideas of what the character is and what the audience as a whole will most likely take that as. If you dress a character in all black, but they're the most positive character in the film, you have to recognize that you may have an understanding of black being really classy and really fun, but the vast majority of the population is going to look at black in a semi-negative light as a color.
It's one of the most fascinating things about the directing process for me is trying to figure out how visual language communicates something to the audience so that you can control what you're communicating. Because in that situation, it's possible that the audience will misunderstand the character. It's possible that the audience will have no idea what's going on and try to make up their own ideas of why they're wearing black. The audience might perceive it as like a deliberately ironic choice. And so on and so forth. But it's this interesting process that's, I guess, rooted in psychology almost, of trying to like figure out, okay, if I move the camera this way, the hallway dolly is a perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
Scorsese is trying to figure out, how can I convey in a very efficient way, in a very straightforward way to the audience, what is happening inside of Travis Bickle right now. And he goes, okay, if I do a shot that in another movie is the reveal that she's coming to reconcile with him, the audience is expecting that that's what's going to happen. Or that it's going to be this moment of she walks in to do so, but here's what he's saying on the phone, and she changes her mind and walks away, right? Like, that's the type of stuff that's we would expect to happen in that shot. But then nothing happens in that shot. And that tells us, just like that, all we need to know. And I would contend it's one of the harder parts of directing.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's so fun. It's so compelling to spend time thinking about that and get to the meat of it.
Oh, and that's where the talent lies, because you have to. The only way you can do that is if you've mastered all the other elements.
Yeah.
And when I say master, I don't mean necessarily that nothing goes wrong and that you're never able to properly communicate, or that you're never in a position where you're incapable of properly communicating something, because there's always going to be a question that comes up to you on a daily basis on a film set that you don't really have an answer to, but you have to give one. And that might happen multiple times. Like you gave me the, I don't know if, I think you had mentioned it, but also, who was it, the director that had their assistant count?
I was just looking that up. My gut says Robert Zemeckis, but I couldn't find it with his name in it.
We'll say Zemeckis for
Sure.
the sake of the legacy and legend of Hollywood, but a director, let's call him Zemeckis, had his assistant on set one day, who was kind of surprised at the stress level that the director had about just a question about what coffee you wanted. He said, "Count for me how many times I get asked a question today."
Yeah.
And they stopped counting once they got to 1,000. And that is every day for a director. It is like you are the captain of a ship, the CEO of a company, like any leadership position you could be in. It is that times 100. Because a film is, the best analogy I can describe it as is exactly what it is. Every individual film is registered as its own LLC. Meaning that each film, not the film company that's producing it, each film is registered as its own business. And what that business does is it creates one product. It takes hundreds, if not thousands of people and millions of dollars, and it assembles it together over the course of a year, maybe 2, maybe 3 if we're counting the writing stage, and then refines that product, and then releases it to the world. And you've got one shot to make your money back for that to be a success. So you, as the director, and as the producers as well, you have to essentially create, refine, and distribute an entire company in 3 years. And whether or not that's successful determines your ability and capacity to do the same thing over and over again. So not only is it very complicated, it's also very high stakes. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting when you step back and look at the process of directing, like, you know, in this film in particular, where you've got a very unique story, you've got a very low budget, you've got, thankfully, a crew that even initially wasn't interested in doing things, but once you figure out how to properly communicate with people, you can get them interested in doing things that are outside of the bounds. You've got big personalities like with what's his name, the scorer,
Bernard Herrmann.
Yeah, Herrmann, the big personality of Herrmann, who shows up to L.A. to do the score and then immediately flies back to London because he's been, self-exiled for 10 years from the Americas, and then you have to get somebody to go retrieve him, and you have weird little personality quirks all over the place like that because despite it being one of the biggest businesses in the world, Hollywood is also probably one of the least professional businesses in the world because you don't go into Hollywood because you're clinically professional. You're usually some level of a personality that you didn't want to be in an office all day. You didn't want to communicate in corporate lingo. And I can understand that because I'm in the same boat.
Yeah.
But that also lends it to people with personalities that are not as refined in relation to professionalism. That exists.
I'm just imagining some of the people I met in LA in the industry, like if they had to work at a bank, like how long they'd last. And it's not very.
And that's the thing is like you look, I mean, I love De Niro's quote from years ago on an Actors Roundtable where he said, you don't go into acting if you don't hate some semblance of yourself on some level. And it's like, yeah, I don't think you go into the arts, period, if you don't have some element of yourself that either you dislike or that you don't fit in at the very least. There's something about the reason you chose to go into movie making or any art whatsoever where there's something that you feel internally doesn't quite compute in the way that you think other people compute around you. Even if that's not true, even if other people who are in finance or who are in real estate may feel the same way that you do, there's something about your personality that went, I'm not going to fit in these worlds. I can't do that. Whether it's internally, I don't vibe with those people, or externally, I want to do something different. I want to create a product that other people will recognize and give me that fulfillment of, appreciation. There are a variety of different reasons that could be the case, but I will stand by the fact that people who go into film, there's something there. There's a reason you go into film instead of law school. What that is, we may never know explicitly, but I think people have made some good indications of the potential reasons for it nonetheless. So it's interesting, again, to bring it back to this movie, when you have people like that making a film like this, it is an interesting exploration of humanity. And I think the reason it was made like this was because as they reconcile, I guess I should say, Schrader, De Niro, and Scorsese, especially Schrader and Scorsese, saw the character of Travis Bickle, and they all said, they were like, this is the kind of film that needs to be made. Why? Because it seems probably a part of them recognized a part of themselves in Travis, as they note, as they have said. And they felt that that needed to be explored. And I think that's the fun part of filmmaking, especially with a film like this, is that you have people who are willing to look at the dark side of humanity and explore it, shine a spotlight on it for the rest of the world to see. And even if you don't have the answer, something that Scorsese frequently said during discussions about this film and about his films in general is the reason he makes films is because he has feelings and thoughts that he can't articulate verbally. He makes the movies that he recognizes something within himself about, and he makes it so that way he can express what's happening inside of him, what he's feeling, what he's thinking, because he can't express it in a way that he would be able to communicate it personally. And I think that's a really cool way to look at his movies, and I think that's a really cool way to analyze internal thought, if you're capable of doing that, if you're in a position where you can create a world, and then you can step back and say, this is how I see the world. This is how I think other people see the world. This is a combination of those two things. What do you think?
To that end of Scorsese and Schrader trying to convey to the audience and put the audience in the shoes of how they see the world, were there any other technical decisions that were made that you felt like contributed to that?
Yeah, I think the color is one. Obviously, they ended up having to do the optical at the end, as I talked about in the silver retention video, which is something that I was not aware of. Part of the reason I love doing the actual silver retention video stuff is because I learn, as we're gearing up to ideally do more narrative in the future, I'm learning more and more about the processes of different elements of filmmaking. My goal is essentially to become more learned in the school of film production, so that way when we do get onto a set and people have questions for me, I have enough of a backlog of information to be able to answer those questions. And
we are figuring out a way to make money by reading a lot about film.
Yes, pretty much. Yeah, exactly. We are actively subsidizing our own future films. That's the goal here.
Exactly.
But so with that is the whole optical thing at the end of the film, where they run the original, I think it was the negative, through a projector that projects onto other film. And then it's 2 levels of film. I think one was a normal color and one was like a black and white. And so he would choose the exposure levels with each, so that way it would be like 80% the color film and 20% the black and white, or 60%, 40%, or 75-25, to be able to work with the level of like brightness of the blood in the film. And I think it's interesting because in learning about the film, he said, Scorsese, I mean, ended up once recognizing the possibility of that, he wanted to do the whole movie in that optical format. Because it was something that Melville did for Moby Dick.
Oh.
At least that's what he said. And or no.
No, Melville wrote Moby Dick.
Yeah, no, Melville's Moby Dick. Somebody,
John Huston.
Yeah, Huston did for Moby Dick. And
it took me a second. I was like, oh
yeah,
when Herman Melville directed Moby
Dick. Yeah, my bad. But anyway, so that was something that he really wanted to play with, but it ended up being too cost prohibitive, so they did it normally. And then, with the end of the film being as bloody as it was, they were forced to do the optical just for that segment, which was kind of annoying for him because he wanted to have the whole piece be cohesive, but at the end of the day, it also allowed him to explore that technique. So it was a bit of a blessing and a curse. I know since he has wished that there was a version of the original print that existed somewhere so he could do a release of the film that would have been the entire normal color spectrum of it. But that, I think, is one element of what you're describing is, initially he wanted to do that weird, semi-color, semi-not experience for the film, for that to embody this kind of even grittier version of New York.
That would have been cool.
Yeah, it would have been cool because it also added that level of extra grain that he felt embodied kind of what he was going for. I think there were talks about, at one point he wanted to do the whole thing in black and white as well. Because it felt the vibe, or it fit the vibe even more. And then he realized Big Yellow Taxi is not really going to do very well in black and white.
No, and I think that...
Plus, it was a selling point at the time.
Yeah. Part of... One of the things I really like about this film is its use of color and its use of things like having the street lights reflected. And...
Which is, again, something he stole from another creator. I can't remember.
Right, and so, like...
Hang on, really quickly, pause.
Ladies and gentlemen, a long latent co-host, formerly of the Lore Lounge, Kat Gascon, everybody.
Woo-hoo.
So you seen Taxi Driver?
No, I haven't.
Those uses of color and the streetlights and all that add something that I've always really appreciated about this film. And as much as I like black and white films, and I don't think filmmakers should shy away from it, even though it's not the norm anymore, it would have there would have been something lost if he'd end up following through on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a time and place for black and white films. I think, especially early in a career, whether it's in school or whether it's an early film, it's something that helps you learn the value of light, specifically how light and shadow and reflection can be played amongst one another to be able to create a visually interesting image. It helps you understand where contrast is valuable and where it isn't. And I think the reason why black and white's better for that than color is because color, you can create contrast within the same value of light in an image, which allows you to play with a lot more detail. But the problem is that there's a tendency for filmmakers to focus more on color than with the actual light itself in a color format. So if you're looking for an exercise to be able to teach yourself how to properly understand the dynamics of light contrast and light value and things like that, black and white's really useful. But I completely agree with you in the sense that this film definitely benefits from color. It definitely benefits from showing New York as true to itself as it is at that time period, or at least in the way they wanted to depict it in that time period. There are certain films where, it's not as important, but I would agree. This one is one where it is extremely valuable.
Yeah, so I think we are coming up on time here. As has become custom, we'll each do our closing note. I'm an awards nerd, so I'm always curious to find out, like, how did festivals and how did the Oscars go and that kind of thing. This film did win Palme d'Or, which was huge for Scorsese's career, and it had stiff competition. It was competing against Bugsy Malone, which is a famous movie, films from Wim Wenders, Eric Rohmer, Roman Polanski, Bernardo Bertolucci, whose film De Niro was also in, or that was out of competition, I guess. But just to give you an idea of the pedigree at this point, Ingmar Bergman's Face to Face, Alfred Hitchcock's final film, Family Plot. Pasolini had a weird one at Cannes that year where it's called Notes Toward an African Orestes, which was a film he had made following his development of an adaptation of the Oresteia, which we talked about as being the story of Agamemnon's son avenging him. Because it all has to come back to the Odyssey on this podcast.
It's going to be a reoccurring theme.
It really is. So he had this documentary crew follow him around as he's developing it, and he actually never ended up making the movie.
Incredible.
But the documentary about the unmade film went to Cannes. Oscar-wise, this was the 49th Academy Awards. It was hosted by Richard Pryor, Ellen Burstyn, Jane Fonda, and Warren Beatty, which is a wild lineup.
Yes, it is.
And to have 4 hosts, I don't know. I think the role of the host was probably somewhat different back at that point of the Oscars. I can't imagine that all 4 of them were all doing stand-up throughout the whole thing in the way that...
I'm going to bet there's a recording of it somewhere, and now I'm curious.
Yeah, we should do a live where we throw a screen up and live react to the 49th Academy Awards. This was Best Picture nominated alongside All the President's Men, Rocky, Network, which is a Sidney Lumet film, and Bound for Glory, which is like a Woody Guthrie biopic that is the least remembered of those. Taxi Driver didn't win anything, but it was nominated, like I said, Best Picture, Best Actor for De Niro, Best Supporting Actress for Foster, and Best Original Score for Bernard Herrmann, which is posthumous. Network and Rocky are the big 2 winners. Taxi Driver, like I said, wins nothing. There was some interesting records that are fun to highlight from this Oscars. Network is one of 3 films ever to win 3 acting Oscars, with A Streetcar Named Desire and Everything Everywhere All at Once. And it was the last film to receive 5 acting nominations.
Interesting.
It was the 11th of 15 films to be nominated in all 4 acting categories. So not only were they nominated in all 4 categories, in one of those categories they were nominated for 2 different performances.
That's wild.
Yeah, which is insane. Peter Finch, the lead of that film, became the first posthumous acting winner. Beatrice Straight, with 5 minutes and 2 seconds, became the shortest performance to ever win an Oscar. Paddy Chayefsky won his 3rd solo writing Oscar, for Network, a record which stands. No other writer has won 3 by themselves. Sylvester Stallone was the first person since Orson Welles to be nominated for writing and acting for the same film. Piper Laurie was so the mom in Carrie was nominated for her 2nd consecutive role 15 years apart.
Wow.
Yeah. She goes on to I Need to Get You to Watch Twin Peaks. She goes on to be in Twin Peaks. 15 years after this. Lena Wertmuller became the first woman ever nominated for Best Director for 7 Beauties. Barbara Streisand became the first woman to win Best Original Song for A Star Is Born, and she remains the only person to win for both acting and songwriting.
Interesting.
Like the only, not even for the same film, like the only person to have wins in both.
I guess there's not a lot of actresses that are also
that category is dominated by generally people who were not in the film. Like nobody's nominating Travis Scott for Best Supporting Actor, not because he didn't do a good job in The Odyssey, but because there are a lot of supporting actors in that film, and he's in 2 scenes.
Yes.
In general, it's not people that are in the movie at all. But yeah, no, lots of just weird records and stuff from that one. But classic example of the Academy not knowing what's going to stand the test of time. Obviously, Rocky and Network are both still beloved films, but there's always a fun pattern to see what they think will be the totemic films of all time, and how often something that they completely overlook ends up being the most well-known of the year. Case in point, Stanley Kubrick's only Oscar is for visual effects.
Which is wild. That's nuts.
All right, so that's your Oscar trivia for the week. What are we closing out with?
I think the best thing to close out with it here is I think this is an interesting example of a very unique film being that which kind of puts a director on the map. I mean, Mean Streets right before this kind of did that. That really just was the ground. That was really just the groundwork for him to be able to move into Taxi Driver. I think this is Spielberg's Jaws. Or sorry, hang on. This is
Schindler's List was Scorsese's Departed.
Yeah, right. No, I'm thinking.
While you think, it's interesting that he gets this Mean Streets gets him some blank check, we'll say, not to step on that podcast's toes too much, but Taxi Driver gets him more, and then he blows it with New York, New York at the end of the decade, and then gets a new blank check from Raging Bull immediately afterward.
Yeah.
It's interesting anomaly to something like, say, Fincher, who does Seven as a second feature, and then he never has to worry about it again.
Yeah, I think that's where I was trying to figure out, because as soon as I started saying that Taxi Driver is Scorsese's Jaws, I immediately thought of Raging Bull, and the reason that I hesitated was that, well, is that more of a opportune example? And I think after you've acknowledged that, no. I think Taxi Driver is Scorsese's Jaws. It's just that this is actually interesting.
This is I'm pulling up Spielberg's filmography right now.
Well, no, because you know what it is? Because Spielberg's New York, New York is 1941.
It is, yes.
So what was the big one after that? Was Close Encounters Raging Bull? I don't think so.
Back to back. Okay, so he does this sort of like made-for-TV stuff. Very low-key stuff. Gets Jaws. That takes off. Then Close Encounters. Then 1941.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 81, it's Raiders of the Lost Ark. 82 is E.T.
That's what it is. So Raiders is Spielberg's Raging Bull.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating to do this exercise because they came up at the same time into, and are friends to this day, dramatically different worlds. One is indie New Yorker. One is L.A. embedded in the studio system from day one.
Mm-hmm.
But
though he was raised in Jersey for the first 8 years of his life, and then over in, what was it, like Arizona?
Yeah, I believe it was Arizona, yeah. So, but it is interesting that they have this parallel of they have this thing right off the bat. I think you could kind of say Jaws and Mean Streets, Close Encounters, and Taxi Driver. Just not necessarily, I wouldn't think too hard into those parallels, just those are the two that are both successive, guarantors.
Yeah.
Then 1941 in New York, where they way overplay their hand. They go nuts. Both of these are, well, no, they're not all that similar as films. But yeah, just very big. They went big. And it was at the end of the 70s.
I would say they're similar in the sense that they went into their definitive weak points.
Yes. Spielberg went to comedy. Scorsese went to a musical.
Yes.
Which, paradoxically, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, he's a tremendous music lover and has made phenomenal nonfiction films about music. He wasn't able to cut it with the music.
Mm-hmm. But it's funny because they are each other's opposites in the sense that Scorsese adds a lot of comedy into his films, and it does very well. And Spielberg did films like West Side Story, which are musicals, and again did very well.
Yeah.
So it's that's a fun play there.
Yeah, and it comes at the end of the 70s where the studios kind of wake up to the fact after several high-profile bombs, or not even some bombs, but then also just disasters. I'm thinking of 1979 was Apocalypse Now. Coppola's follow-up was a big box office bomb financially. I don't remember what it's called. William Friedkin did Sorcerer, lost a lot of money, and got just whacked at the box office by Star Wars because Friedkin decided he was going to open against Star Wars. And people told him, do you want to do this? He's like, no one's going to watch that shit. I love Friedkin, but he was something. And then you had New York, New York, you had 1941, and you also had Twilight Zone, the movie, where Vic Morrow and two child actors were killed in a safety incident.
Right.
So Spielberg himself, after that, went out publicly and is like, it's time for unfettered directorial freedom to end because it is causing all of these irresponsible productions that might not have any tragedies. Like Apocalypse Now, as far as I know, didn't have anything like that serious happen, but it still was a mess. It still was pretty unprofessional.
Mm-hmm.
And it ends up resulting in both financial failure and the possibility for the lack of oversight to result in harm being done to people.
And it's funny that Spielberg was the one who said it.
Yeah.
Considering he was one of the original free directors from the late 60s, early 70s.
Exactly. But he also, amongst them, was the most overseen, given that he's all doing this from inside.
Yeah, and he was best friends with the head of Universal. What was his name? Scheinberg?
Yes.
Sid Scheinberg?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Compared to Scorsese or Coppola and others who were independent, they were completely on their own.
Yeah, or Lucas, who was probably the most independent of all of them.
Yeah, where he's like, oh, you're not gonna let me. What was it like? The union didn't let him eschew opening credits, so he's like, okay, I'm just gonna start my own company and do it myself.
Pretty much. Yeah.
So then they both come out of that, both going like way back to their strengths.
Mm-hmm.
Scorsese goes to Raging Bull, which is like very familiar to his personal life, much smaller scale. Spielberg is like, well, wait a minute, my strength was adventure films. Has been, not that Close Encounters is truly an adventure film, but like that's his bread and butter that he's started out with. He's wanted to do stuff that gives you a sense of transportation and a sense of you're going on it. I guess the character in Close Encounters does sort of go on an adventure, even though it's not a genre in that genre per se. So they both go right to their strengths, and then from there on, they can do whatever the hell they want. So cool. I've never lined it all up like that.
Neither have I.
Makes a lot of sense, and it's very similar almost to The Year as well.
Yeah.
So, all right, I think we've just about done it.
Yeah, I think we've exhausted what we have to say about Taxi Driver to the point where we've talked about a number of things other than Taxi Driver.
Yes, we have. Yeah, that's the we stayed away from DC successfully.
Yes.
Somehow we did not bring this back to Superman.
Yeah, I think that's probably for the best.
You almost did it because you were talking about, well, this character could have a costume that has bright colors because they convey optimism. And I was like, don't do it. Don't fucking do it.
No, we successfully stayed away from DC. Didn't stay away from the Odyssey. We'll see if that ever happens. But I think next time, what are we talking about?
Next time will be Heat.
Right.
I recognize that this is the second consecutive episode in which I said next time will be Heat, but next time will literally be Heat. This time we will actually be in Heat.